Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to go and get yourself something lovely to drink, something very refreshing, especially with summer on the horizon. I'm sure lots of you enjoy some sparkling lemonade or something like that. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Erin Nocton Wood was a quiet, demure young lady who enjoyed spending long periods of time in her own company. She had grown up in North Carolina with two brothers and an older sister who had long since left home and abandoned the nest. They were now married and had children of their own. She was a serendipitous surprise bundle. Her parents never anticipated arriving in their lives, like a snowdrop appearing very late in the season. It would seem Erin's mother gained a significant amount of weight around her middle. She had thought the pregnant-looking bump was in fact menopausal weight gain, so it was rather a shock to her when she realized she was pregnant 6 months down the line. She hadn't even fleetingly suspected a thing, for Erin had not so much kicked inside her even a teensy-weensy bit, much like her other children had done. Erin's mother, Paige, was so shocked and bewildered that she was in fact pregnant. She couldn't bring herself to admitting to her husband that the ambiguous fatty deposits around her middle were absolutely nothing to do with the menopause. It took a long while for her to summon up the courage to tell her husband she was in fact pregnant. She was sure he was going to be less than amused and charmed with the startling revelation, blowing a fuse, as now their children had flown the nest. They had grand ideas of going travelling abroad, branching out to explore new exotic horizons, and even buy a place in the sun in Florida, preferably with oceanfront views. By all accounts, some things don't pan out how you expect them to do so, and those trips to exciting new parts of the world were put on the back burner, as they had a sprog on the way, so their entire focus had to be on the new arrival that was soon to touch their lives. Paige did not want to even know the sex of her child, but given the child appeared to be so very quiet in her womb, she decided she was going to be giving birth to a very gentle, sensitive little girl, and it appeared that she was right on the money about that. In the beginning, the couple were not quite sure how to react to a baby arriving so unseasonably, but they soon adjusted to Erin's fortuitous arrival, and from the moment she was born and she let out her first cry, Paige and her husband were tickled pink and totally beguiled by their little girl. When Erin was merely 3 years old, tumbling around happily in the strawberry bushes in the backyard, pulling the delicious sweet fruit out of the ground randomly, and unapologetically stuffing it into her tiny mouth, which was soon stained in a bright cherry colour, so that she looked quite a sight, but she was so comical to watch. Her tiny sticky hands and pretty floral dress were unambiguously soaked in strawberry juices. Erin's mother began to laugh at her cute little daughter's unbridled enthusiasm at frenziedly ravaging the strawberry beds, but her amusement was short-lived, dying almost a fast, lethal death, when suddenly her daughter let out a loud, rasping scream, and Erin's mother's heart dropped like a heavy stone being thrown into a deep body of water. Her maternal instincts were spiked. She knew her daughter was in serious trouble. She could taste the sense of foreboding on her tongue. Her stomach recoiled in horror. With her heart swinging in her chest like a pendulum, she came dashing up to her daughter, to find her daughter clutching her cheek, which began to swell up like a balloon. What seemed like seconds later, poor little Erin was struggling to breathe, gasping, spluttering and choking desperately. But most frightening of all, her airways were closing up far too quickly. A bee bit me, Mummy! A bee bit me! She cried out. Erin had been stung by a bee, and the lower part of her face blew up like a balloon. Erin's mother began to panic so much that her fingers failed to dial the emergency services, as they kept slipping off the phone. But finally she managed to call them, hardly being able to articulate anything remotely audible. stung by a bee. She can't breathe. She's not breathing. Please, please send someone now. Little Erin had come a hair's breadth that day to losing her life, but thanks to the help of a very skilled EMT who had an EpiPen at his disposal, Erin very quickly recovered. The bad news was that the little girl was badly allergic to bees, and her close call she had had with death had made her parents realize that Erin was absolutely the best thing that had happened in their late lives after their older children had left home, and they appreciated what an incredible blessing she really was to them. To be parents the second time around was a great privilege to them. Ostensibly, all their ideas of travelling around the globe now seemed shallow, insignificant, and almost pointless, as the fun they were having raising their late little lamb was unrivalled. "She is so special," Erin's mother had said. "Who would have thought I'd have another baby? She is such a treasure. Best thing that's ever happened to us both." Her husband had heartily agreed. "I feel as if I'm back in my 30s again. I've had a second chance of raising kids. It's quite wonderful." In the beginning, both parents had believed another child was a rude intrusion in their lives, but Erin had proven to be the sweetest, very quiet child, undemanding in every single way. Indeed, she gave her parents so little trouble that sometimes they didn't even know she was there. All their other children they'd raised had been rambunctious, rather fiery balls of energy. They could be heartily annoying, very demanding, and incredibly noisy. But Erin proved to be a thoughtful, reflective child who thoroughly enjoyed playing on her own, very quietly, and spending time just listening in to adult conversations without saying a single word. It didn't appear to worry her that she didn't have another brother or sister to play with at hand, for she managed to entertain herself very resourcefully. When Erin was in her teens, she abhorred social media platforms of every kind, and looked on cell phones as an intrusive invasion in her life that she'd only ever use for those urgent phone calls. Let's just say people were annoyed they couldn't get hold of her all the time, including her own parents. Erin abhorred the idea that with a cell phone your life invited no privacy whatsoever, that you could so easily be trapped wherever you went. She believed that was terribly invasive and intrusive in people's lives. One day people would be completely controlled by our governments, where every move you made was monitored, and that nothing was sacred anymore, which Erin thought stole your dignity and self-respect, and your freedom, of course. "Some people think a cell phone is liberating, Mum," she'd say. "I get where they're coming from when they say that. It's good if you need to call 911, or you get caught up in the mud with a flat tire and need to call for roadside assistance. It's also nice to catch up with your friends once in a while. But beyond that, it really is a noose around your neck. And if you're not careful, it can slowly consume your entire life, so you're focusing only on your cell phone. I don't want people to be able to track me whatever I do. Don't you see, if the government can track us like this, they will completely control our lives one day. That is where all this technology is heading, and it's a hell of a scary if you ask me. They want us to be dependent on them, and then they'll finally use it against us. They'll control our bank accounts, what we do, where we go, and we'll be powerless to do a damn thing about it. They're leading us towards a cashless society for this very reason. I'll tell you this, Mum, no one is ever going to control me. I won't let them. I will use my cell phone when I need to, but I'm not going to take it with me wherever I go. That's what they want, and I'm not going to oblige them. It's insane. People managed perfectly well without cell phones in the past, before they came along, and so shall I, she had insisted. I think, my dear, you should have been born in the 1950s, her mother had teased. You're such a nonconformist, Erin, my darling, and I do love you for your individuality, that's for sure. You know what, Mum? I think I was born in the wrong generation. You're right about that. I'd have liked to have lived in a world without all this social media. Why are people so fixated about it? It makes my mind boggle. I wonder what people from the 1950s think about the changes in the world over the generations. Do you think they think things have gone pear-shaped? I think many do, said Erin's mother reflectively. You'll find a lot of older people still struggle with all this brand new technology. And Mrs. Rotherstone is no exception in that regard. The woman's in her 80s. She refuses to use a cell phone, so you're not alone in your misgivings about all this stuff. Well, it's good to know that I'm not a complete weirdo then. I admit there are informative websites on our cell phones and stuff to enjoy for our entertainment purposes, and I don't want to kibosh all those advantages. But using your cell phone all the time can take over your life, and in my opinion, that's nonsensical. Everywhere you go, people are tuning out of the world and drifting into an alternative reality. It's like people zoning out of their regular lives, if you know what I mean. I've seen friends of mine more intent on taking hundreds of pictures with their cell phones rather than getting down to enjoying themselves. When I went to the Oregon coast with Kathy Finnegan, that girl was posting pictures of our holiday all the time, doing nothing else. It was so insane. I told her as much. She practically bit my head off when I pointed that out. She barely stopped to draw breath to enjoy her surroundings. Well, it's good that you pointed it out to her, isn't it? Hopefully she'll take stock of what you had to say. I doubt it, said Erin. She was very defensive. When Erin was in her teens, she loved nothing better in her free time to take long casual walks in the woods. She lived in a prepossessing green leafy neighbourhood where all the houses were facing the street and were relatively closely spaced, so you could get the impression on first appearances that the properties were smaller than they actually were. But most possessed sizable backyards, and some were large enough to boast stable blocks and paddocks. It was an attractive countrified neighbourhood, where most of the very classic-style houses had been built in the 1950s, but had been refurbished and transformed in recent years, so all were individualistic, rather like their owners, and not one house in the street looked like another, which Erin thought made the street very special. The pavements on either side of the log ribbon of asphalt were shaded by tall, lofty trees, which always peppered the road in winter and summer in a pretty gossamer light. It was particularly pleasant for walkers either taking a stroll towards the south to the town and in a northerly direction to the woodgrove. It was a friendly neighbourhood where everyone knew each other by name, where you could pop over to your neighbour's house to borrow a bowl of sugar, if needs must. The neighbourhood had a rural influence to it, so it wasn't unusual to see someone on horseback riding down the street towards the sprawling woodgrove, which invited large, open, very generous sprawling riding, bicycle and hiking trails that spread out like an all-encompassing yawn. Erin liked to take the 20-minute trek from her home to the woodgrove that many locals had forsaken over the years, due to the idle rumours and speculation about the place that had tarnished its appeal and shredded its beguiling reputation. It possibly left some residents reluctant to go exploring there. Most dog walkers preferred to settle for the local park, which was only a couple of streets away in a westerly direction, and was a magnificent place to meet other dog walkers and to sit back on a park bench under the tall lofty trees, watching your dogs frolicking happily with their friends. One of the major attractions to the park was the sizable man-made silvery lake it boasted, where large congregations of ducks would gather that you could feed, and rowing boats you could hire that made people thoroughly enjoy gravitating towards the park rather than the woodgrove. So it wasn't uncommon to see families, especially on a Sunday afternoon, picnicking around the lake. Erin loved being out in nature, hugged effusively by the warm, open arms of the natural world. She saw the woodgrove as the perfect escape, where she was unlikely to encounter another single soul, unless, of course, they were on horseback or on a mountain bike or ATV. She took no notice of idle speculations and nonsensical rumours that to her really didn't mean a thing. "I cannot believe you walk there all on your own," people would tell her in astonishment. "If you want my advice, Erin, you should walk around the park, not go to the woods. You know the woods are haunted. It's a menacing place. Bad things have happened there over the years." "I wouldn't be seen dead hiking through all those trees on my own. Goodness gracious me, that is asking for trouble. Anything could be out there. People have seen things in those trees, you know.
And there have been ghostly sightings that go back for many generations, back to the 1800s. And do I need to even remind you that more recently events there have not been good, to say the very least?
It was indeed true that a prostitute had been found lying in the woodgrove a year earlier, and it looked like she'd been brutally murdered, and the man guilty of her murder still remained at large, which was an unsettling fact. If that was not bad enough, 5 years prior to that grisly discovery, a man had been found hanging in the woodgrove, swinging from a tree like a pendulum, after having committed suicide. It turned out that the man was a New York resident, and was not even from North Carolina. And then there was the story of the vagrant, who parked himself outside the bakery in town for years and years at a time. But one day he'd been found mysteriously lying dead amongst the trees, with a bottle of whiskey tumbling out of his ice-cold white hands. Erin perceived that these things happen in life. You cannot spend your life shrinking away from stuff because bad things can happen. It would seem Erin's parents agreed with the locals that their daughter should not take long walks in the woods, but Erin could not be persuaded to change her mind, so her father insisted she took a canister of pepper spray in the woods with her, just in case.
In case what? Erin had protested. Well, you know, a woman walking on her own in an expansive, sprawling woods like that. All manner of unsavoury characters could be lurking around. You can never be too careful these days, my dear. I also think, my darling, you should take your cell phone when you go for your walk, Erin's mother had intervened. I mean, what if I need to call you, or something urgent pops up? I do so hate it that you never answer your phone, my love. You were born in a modern age, weren't you? You can't just shut out technology like this. I mean, look at me. I was born in a completely different generation to you, when we didn't even have cell phones. And yet mine never leaves my side. Why can't you be the same? There you go again, Mum. Don't you see the bloody thing is controlling you? I'm sorry it is. If I told you, Mum, I hate it for that specific reason. I know that makes me idiosyncratic and a little bit weird to you. But guess what? I don't care what you think, what anybody else thinks for that matter. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. Do what you like, my darling, but as long as you have your EpiPen with you at all times and a pepper canister, I'll breathe a little easier. It would make me very happy if you take your phone along with you for the ride. It doesn't have to be on, you know. But if you tripped over and fell over a log, at least you could call us for help. You know it makes perfect sense, said her mother gingerly, eyeing her daughter through pleading eyes. Ma'am, I've been walking in the woodgrove for years, you know I have. You hear some horrifying stories and you begin to panic. That's what this is all about. I get it. I really do. It's a parent's privilege to be like that. But the only people I've seen in the woodgrove over the years are horse riders, ATV riders, and the occasional walker, and sometimes somebody riding a bicycle. But they've all been very friendly towards me. I've never seen anyone unsavoury lurking around there. That may be true, my love, but you can ask your father. There really are seriously weird people in this world of ours. And one day one of those less than desirable characters could be hanging around in the woodgrove just when you are. What about the prostitute found lying dead in the grove of trees a year earlier? Someone had to have killed her, and they've never been caught. You would do well to remember that.
Erin's father rubbed his full moustache reflectively, peering at Erin kindly through his rather dapper-looking spectacles that brought out the blue-grey colour of his kind eyes.
Your mother's right, my darling. We live in a rural neighbourhood, I know. But you need to have your wits about you at all times. You need to make sure one eye looks over your shoulder, and you should be very sharp, shrewd, and discerning. If you see someone remotely suspicious, make sure you keep your distance, and try to get the hell away from the woodgrove. I don't mean to goad you, my dear. It's the last thing I want to do, because I know you treasure your freedom. But this is not the 1950s, when people could play freely on the streets. We are getting closer to the days of the Wild West in this generation, when anything goes. We are living in significantly darker times. I just need you to be aware of these things. You are our last-born beloved child, and I would loathe anything untoward to happen to you. But I don't want to deprive you of your freedom either. I know you are a free spirit, my love, and me and your mother, we appreciate that about you. God broke the mold when he made you. Most kids beg their parents to buy them all this high-tech stuff. You have no interest in it at all, and it's refreshing. But your mother is right. The man that murdered that prostitute is still at large, so you would do well to be cautious when you go out on your own. I would give the same advice to anyone in the whole of North America venturing out on their own, especially if they're a young woman like yourself. Erin threw her arm lovingly around her father and gave him a big fat kiss on his cheek. I love you, Dad, but don't you dare worry about me. I can look after myself, I promise you I can. She privately wondered why her parents were making such a fuss. Wasn't it true that every wooded area at some point had been exposed to some weird, outlandish, enigmatic stories, many of which people could never explain? It went with the territory of vast areas of sprawling wilderness, where people sometimes went missing, and bizarre, strange things occurred, some that sounded so far-fetched it was hard to make sense of them at all. As for the prostitute murdered a year earlier, the man responsible for the crime would be likely long gone. But Erin kept such thoughts to herself. Over the years, Erin had heard stories about cryptid creatures like Bigfoot, the Wendigo, Dogman, and so forth, but she had no hard and fast thoughts about whether she believed in such preposterous things. She was open-minded enough to admit that indeed such things could possibly exist. Never in a million month of Sundays would Erin have ever envisaged that she would have an encounter with such an idiosyncratic creature known as Bigfoot. Nor did she know that one good deed would ultimately lead to another. Erin's mother didn't like Erin rambling around those woods one bit. But Erin was not the kind of teenager you could bully. She had a mind of her own, and she liked to live her life with the freedom of a bird. She couldn't bear the idea of having clipped wings, and if she abided by her parents' whims, she would genuinely feel like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Her parents knew this to be the truth, and that it would be cruel to do that to Erin, for such behaviour would make their daughter completely miserable. It was very early on a Saturday morning that Erin arose out of bed. It was still quite dark outside. She was going to take an early morning hike into the woodgrove. She left a note for her parents on the refrigerator saying, "Gone for a walk in the woodgrove. Got my EpiPen, pepper spray, and my cell phone with me, although it's switched off. Don't you dare worry about me. See you at about lunchtime. Love, Erin." She could almost see her mother sighing over the breakfast table, shaking her short-cropped brown hair indignantly and saying, "Oh, my dear, that daughter of ours will make me old before my time." She had already announced that Erin was the very reason she'd gone completely grey. But then again, she was getting older, and at her age she should be going grey anyway. But her mother dyed her hair as regular as clockwork, in a pretty kaleidoscope of honey blondes, browns, and russets that helped her look significantly younger. Erin's mother refused to remember her age, and if you asked her how old she was, she genuinely could not remember. She said she'd stopped counting the numbers, as focusing on your age was both futile and pointless. It was so beautiful that morning, as Erin walked down the long pavement, under the large canopy of leafy trees. She felt unusually happy and spirited that morning, probably because it was mid-spring, and the weather at this time of the year was glorious. Wherever you looked, trees were bursting with a confetti of ethereal blossoms, wearing their fragrant dressings with a measure of pride. Erin was wearing a pair of jeans and a sweater, and was carrying a knapsack over her back. She was an attractive 18-year-old girl, with long honey-blonde hair and blue eyes that were a lot like her father's. Erin noticed the bleached colours of the people's rather drab front yards were now fading away, as the greenness of spring had cast its magical wand over everything, transforming the dull into the beguiling. Lawns were bespeckled with morning dew,
and Erin was greeted to the pretty sound of birdsong in the trees, and a marmalade cat eyeing her warily from the neighbour's wraparound porch, where he perched on a banister, happily licking his paws. Erin decided that she and this cat were probably the most sane beings on the entire planet at this very minute, for anyone still parked in their beds at this time of the morning, like lonely cars in their garages, were missing out on an awful lot. This, in Erin's opinion, was quintessentially the best time of the entire day, to be out and about very early. Her idea of exercise was walking in nature. If you ran, you missed out on the definitive details of things. If you were in a gym, you were shut away from the still breezes that rustled through the trees, the soft sunshine that kissed your cheeks, the beautiful impertinent smells that titillated your nostrils, and the feeling of the undulating earthen floor accommodating your boots. As Erin strode in the woodgrove, little did she realize that this morning's hike would be one that she would never be likely to forget. But it would also be an experience that Erin would never share with anyone, for if indeed she told her parents about it, they would likely have their worries fueled with even more loaded ammunition as to why she should not go sauntering off into the woods on her own, and she could not allow that to happen. If she was to tell friends, there would be a mixed reception of doubters and believers, but most would likely think she had lost leave of her senses. In Erin's experience, some secrets were best not shared, and being such a private person, it wasn't difficult to keep her experience safely guarded. Erin was getting significantly warmer as she headed up the steep rocky trail, where obtrusive roots like the veins in an old woman's hand protruded fiercely through the ground in contorted, twisted knots. She navigated her way easily over these jagged intrusions, for she knew the terrain here as well as the back of her hand, for she visited these woods often enough. The trees and the indigenous animals she considered her close friends. The large, generous open trails narrowed significantly, as trees on some parts of the trail were clustered together ever so tightly, along with the occasional bush of thorny briars, and the tangles of shrubs and ferns that brushed abrasively against her clothes. Her breathing became fast and furious, as she was moving quite quickly through the trees. She was beginning to feel quite hot, so she removed her outer sweater, wrapping it around her middle in a knot. She was thoroughly enjoying the feeling of the pleasing sun on her face, as prisms of its pleasurable warmth peeped mischievously through the open canopy above her head. Erin whistled contentedly to herself, as she occasionally kicked up pieces of loose dirt, twigs and leaf litter along the path. She so enjoyed being out here all on her own, among the prepossessing mellow nature of the large towering trees. But her peaceful tranquillity was soon gravely disturbed. All of a sudden she heard the loud, very dreadful, frantic cry. She froze to the spot. What the hell was that? She wondered. What the hell? It sounded like a young woman was being murdered, and the ominous sound sent a feeling of impending dread trickling down her spine. Many, hearing such a disembodied, frantic cry, might have got the hell out of the woodgrove, feeling certain that the place was lightly haunted by the ghostly spectre of the prostitute that had recently been murdered here a year prior. Perhaps her lost, tormented soul was now wandering these woods, unaware that she was actually even dead. It would have been easy to conclude such a thing, for the scream had an ethereal, outer-worldly, airy quality to it that left every hair on Erin's neck standing up on end. It would likely have made any skeptic in the supernatural a hardened believer, that was for sure. When Erin heard the scream again, she knew it came not from a ghost. It sounded like a young woman was in desperate trouble and was fighting for her life. Erin felt herself almost blushing in shame. Maybe all her parents' grievous concerns about the safety of this woodgrove were not unfounded after all, and her mulishly stubborn insouciance to their wizened advice was nothing short of foolish folly. Suppose the murderer who'd killed the prostitute a year earlier was up to his duplicitous games all over again, and come back to the scene of the crime. Had he dragged a prostitute kicking and screaming to the grove, and now was in the process of bludgeoning her to death and getting some kind of macabre pleasure from her grievous despair,
as she fought back with all her might. It didn't even occur to Erin to call for help. Instead, she hurriedly grabbed a large, satisfactory piece of timber from the woodland floor as a makeshift weapon that she'd happily use against the predatory attacker. It would seem her pepper spray was tucked safely in her pocket. She could feel its light pressure in her jeans. She knew she would use it if needs must. Erin rocketed towards the open clearing in the trees, huffing and puffing as she gasped for breath. Her knuckles were growing white from holding on to the timber beam so tightly. When she reached the meadow, everything looked benign, very benevolent. A breeze rustled through the knee-high grass, and the warm sunshine filtered through a cornflower blue sky. Erin's eyes narrowed as she scanned the meadow. Then she heard the frantic, desperate scream all over again, and saw a small figure buckled over in the grass. "Get your hands off her!" Erin screamed out. "You hear me? Get your hands off her, or I'll bloody kill you! I'm telling you, I've called the police," she lied. What Erin was expecting to see, she wasn't entirely sure, but what she encountered was so astounding that she was almost beginning to wonder if she was dreaming. She was to discover a 4-foot female Bigfoot that was clearly still a youngling, crying out in agonizing pain. It appeared as if the creature was unable to breathe, and looked to be terribly afraid. Erin instinctively knew what was happening, for it had happened to her a couple of times before. The little Bigfoot's face was swelling up, its airways closing fast. It was struggling desperately to breathe. The brown, treacle-coloured eyes stared at Erin pleadingly, as if they were begging her to help. Erin realised that this little Bigfoot had been stung by a bee, and it was clearly allergic to the sting. She could see the cheeks on the Bigfoot's face had swollen up like a large balloon, as the Bigfoot was gasping and going into an anaphylactic shock. Erin hurriedly opened up her rucksack, pulled out her EpiPen, which she plunged into the little Bigfoot's arm. Not once did Erin feel remotely afraid, for this little Bigfoot to her was like a human child just covered in hair, that was in obvious distress, in desperate need of help. The brown eyes then focused on Erin. She was surprised to see that they were full of trust, as if they knew at once that Erin was helping her. Erin put her comforting arms around the little female Bigfoot, who was clinging to her tightly, as if she didn't want to let Erin go. The Bigfoot remained locked in Erin's warm embrace, as Erin soothed it with her kind words. "You're going to be all right, I promise," she said, talking softly to the creature. "Everything's fine. You're just allergic to bees. You've had an anaphylactic shock, that's all. I'm also allergic to bees, so that's why I know what's happening to you. This has happened to me twice before. The EpiPen, it'll bring down your swelling." The Bigfoot's frantic breathing slowed down considerably. The creature's airways slowly opened, and the brown eyes stared up in Erin's adoringly, for she knew without a doubt that Erin had saved her life, and she wore gratitude on her face like nothing Erin had ever seen before. As strange as this may sound, Erin felt as if she was comforting just a regular child when she rocked this female Bigfoot, and it was, for her, the most natural thing in the entire world. Erin heard the sound of thunderous feet booming towards them, rushing at an incredible speed, like a frantic windstorm. She found herself being studied by a Herculean-sized female Bigfoot, who stood there staring down at Erin for a long while, as though confounded to see a regular human being comforting her child, which was likely a rather unsettling sight for such an imposing, intimidating creature. Erin spoke to the large female Bigfoot, although she was sure that this incredibly powerful creature would not understand a word she was saying. But it seemed the right thing to do to try and communicate in some way, so that the female could comprehend what was going on, and why Erin was reassuring her child. "Don't you worry. Your girl is going to be fine. She was just bitten by a bee. I think she's allergic. I used an EpiPen to bring down the swelling. She'll be all right, though. I can assure you of that." The mother looked at Erin and nodded, as if she understood exactly what Erin was saying. How was that even possible? It was like there was no communication barrier between the two of them. In normal circumstances, had Erin encountered such a robust, powerful creature in the woodgrove, she'd likely be terrified out of her skin, as next to this lofty female, with her ponderous shoulders and exceptionally sturdy proportions, she felt like a fragile porcelain doll. But it was the mother's kind, benevolent eyes that made Erin assured that she was in the company of an emotionally intelligent creature who was approachable and as human as she was. The little Bigfoot bounded away from Erin's arms, enveloping itself into her mother's arms, holding the EpiPen in her hands and pointing to Erin as if she was some kind of demigod that had saved the day. This 4-foot Bigfoot, who moments ago was struggling to breathe, was now chattering away excitingly. While its mother hung on to its every word, she listened intently. It spoke to her in an indigenous language that, although ancient in its origins, was miraculously translated into her mind in English. The female then spoke to Erin. Gelani kwasa, ho lati laki, ho shokono saki lasi, mati lani kwa, ho li laki la, omu konosika, hati la kwa. I'm indebted to you. You have saved my daughter's life. There are no words I can say to thank you for your great kindness. I hope to pay you back in kind one day. Erin watched as mother and daughter Bigfoot gave her a gentle nod and then glided away through the grove of trees. She could hear them chattering garrulously to each other until their voices had grown all but faint, so that she could barely hear them at all. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Till then, goodbye and good night.